There are stories you don't need to see to truly feel welcome to a quiet night, where the rain outside your window and the soft notes of a gentle piano blend together to hold space for a story that asks nothing of you except to simply rest and feel. Tonight, I want to tell you about a little girl, a child who could not hear and could not see, and yet somehow, she helped the world see itself more clearly. I first heard her story on a cold winter afternoon in Vermont. In a tiny bookstore tucked between pine trees, the owner told me about her, like sharing something sacred, not out of pity, but with a quiet kind of reverence. "Have you ever imagined," she asked, "what it would be like to wake up in a world with no sound, no color, no shape, only silence and shadows?" I hadn't. But there was once a little girl who lived in that world, and somehow she found a way out, not with her eyes, not with her ears, but with her heart, with patience, and with hands that learned how to listen. Tonight, we'll listen too, slowly, gently. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes now. Because sometimes, you don't need to see anything to feel everything. The girl and the locked away world. I used to think that loneliness only came when someone left me. But then, I heard the story of a little girl, a child whose loneliness didn't come from being left behind, but from the world itself quietly slipping away. They said she was born healthy, bright-eyed, playful, curious, the kind of baby who laughed often and reached out toward every sound. And then, just as she began to walk, a fever arrived like an uninvited guest. It didn't stay long. But when it left, it took nearly everything with it: her hearing and her sight. No more voices, no more faces, only an invisible, the silent world no one could explain to a child so small. She might not have known what had changed, but she could feel it. That something had vanished. That somehow, without knowing how or why, she had been sealed inside a room no one else could enter. At first, they said, she still smiled, still reached for her mother's dress, still held her face to the breeze, as if sunlight had a shape she could still touch. But little by little, her expressions faded. She couldn't hear the gentle voices that once comforted her. She couldn't see the arms stretched out to catch her. No one knew how to reach her anymore. And so she began to lash out. When she wanted something, she would grab someone's hand and push it onto the object. When she was denied, she would scream, not because she was spoiled, but because she had no other way. She had feelings, she had needs, she had a voice, but it had no sound, no direction, no door to leave through. Her mother once said, it was the most helpless feeling in the world, to stand in front of your own child and feel like you couldn't get close enough to hold her. There was one moment they remembered. A rainy afternoon. The little girl stood by the window, unable to see the sky, unable to hear the rain. But she reached out her hand and felt a single drop land on her skin. Just for a second, her face lit up, not because she understood what it was, but because she had felt something real. They said, It was the first time she smiled in weeks. Most of the time, though, she remained trapped in her silent world. People in the house began to avoid her, not out of anger, but out of quiet grief. Her father buried himself in work. Her mother grew tired and thin, and the little girl drifted further away. Some called it a tragedy, that a life could be so limited, so early, that there would be no way out. But what struck me most about her story wasn't the silence she lived in. It was the fact that even in that silence, she never truly gave up. She kept trying, kept reaching, kept feeling, kept searching, as if deep inside, she believed someone someday might reach back. And then one day, someone did. Someone walked into her life with no miracle cure, no big promises, just a suitcase, a steady heart, and a pair of hands that knew how to wait. When hands became language, no one believed that door could ever be opened. Because for years, they had tried, and then they had stopped. But one day, someone arrived, a young woman, barely older than the girl she came to teach. Thin, determined, with tired shoes and eyes that did not flinch. And always in her hands, a small, worn notebook. They called her Annie. But to me, she was something else. Someone who carried a key, not to unlock a door, but to simply sit beside it and wait. Annie didn't come with grand expectations. She believed in one simple thing, that if a heart still longed to connect, then no door, no matter how thick, was ever truly sealed. On her first day, Annie didn't speak. She didn't wave or gesture. She simply sat beside the little girl and placed her hand gently into hers. I imagined that moment. A child who could not hear, could not see, suddenly feeling the presence of someone not trying to fix her, just trying to be near. And then Annie began to speak, not with her voice, not with a chalkboard or paper, but by tracing letters into the child's open palm, slowly, patiently, day after day, as if she were planting seeds in a soil no one else believed could grow. The girl didn't understand at first. The letters were meaningless lines. She resisted, pulled away, grew frustrated. But Annie didn't stop. She came back the next morning, and the next. Every day, just a few words. Doll, cup, book. They didn't mean much on their own. But Annie believed that one day, one of them might land somewhere deeper. And then it happened. One quiet afternoon, Annie led the girl to the water pump behind the house. Under the cool splash of the stream, she guided the girl's hand beneath the flow. The child paused, startled by the sudden chill on her skin. Right then, Annie traced a word into her palms, W-A-T-E-R. The girl froze. Something had shifted. She turned her hand to the pump again, then to the puddle on the ground, then to the wet fabric of her dress. And each time, Annie wrote the same word, W-A-T-E-R, over and over again. The child's face lit up. She pulled Annie's hand urgently, asking for more. She wanted to know what else had a name. The earth, the wind, the fabric, the skin. Everything suddenly begged for words. And just like that, The door wasn't locked anymore. It had never really been. It just needed someone willing to keep knocking with kindness. That night, the little girl couldn't sleep. She went around the room, touching everything, bringing Annie's hand to object after object, asking silently, "What's this? And this? And this?" In the days that followed, she learned dozens of new words. Not through eyes, not through ears, just through touch, and a heart that refused to stay silent. Annie wasn't a magician. She wasn't a miracle. She was simply the first person who had the patience to learn the language of the girl's world. And because of that, a miracle happened anyway. Her hands, once used only to grasp, became her voice, her questions, her way of saying, "I'm here." I often wonder, how many of us could open if someone simply sat beside us, didn't walk away, and traced something kind into the palm of our lives? The first words of a waking soul. After that afternoon by the water pump, something in the house quietly changed. No one said it aloud, but they could feel it. As if a tiny door had creaked open, and from inside the stillness, a bit of light was beginning to slip through. That night, the little girl didn't want to sleep. She moved through the room, touching everything. A pillow, the edge of the table, the side of the chair, pulling her mother's hand again and again, gently, asking without words, "What's this? What's that?" But she didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She just asked. Hungry. Curious. Alive. Every time her hand met something new, she looked for Annie, and waited for the letters to be written gently into her palm. Book, lamp, chair, hair. Each one landed like a drop of water on soil that had waited years for rain. These weren't just words. They were proof that she could be understood, that her thoughts weren't trapped forever. Annie said that within days, the girl learned over 30 words. Not because she was gifted in the way people usually mean it, but because she had been waiting so long for a way out. That once it arrived, she ran toward it with everything she had. But the most powerful moment came not when she asked for an object, but when she tapped her chest, pointed to herself, and asked, "What's my name?" When Annie paused, then wrote slowly into her hand, "E.M.E. Helen." I'm not sure if she understood the idea of identity in that exact moment, but something changed in her expression. Something softened and deepened. She knew now she had a name. She existed. She was someone. And from that moment on, her questions grew bigger. Not just, "What is this?" but, "Why? What happens next? What does it mean?" Annie once wrote in a letter, one day. She pointed to a tree branch with no leaves and asked me, "Why is there no leaf?" That wasn't vocabulary. That was thought. That was growth. She began learning not just nouns, but feelings, concepts, ideas with no edges. One day Annie cried. Not loudly, just a quiet tear at the edge of a long day. The girl touched her cheek, felt the wetness, and then wrote in Annie's hand, wet but warm. She didn't have the word for emotion, but she felt it, named it, described it in her own way. I believe that was the moment she began to listen, not with her ears, but with her entire heart. Later, she would write. Each word I learned was like a brick, and with them, I built a bridge from myself to the world. And I think that's what language is, really. A bridge. Not just to say what something is, but to say, I'm here, and I want to understand. People began to take notice. They came to see the girl who couldn't hear or see, learning at a pace few could match. Some wept, some questioned, but Annie didn't teach for applause. She taught because she saw a soul knocking from the inside. A girl who had never stopped trying, only waiting for someone to knock back. If every child had that kind of patience waiting for them, maybe the world would be a softer place. Helen didn't become remarkable because she was fixed. She became remarkable because someone believed she wasn't broken. And from that belief, the first words of a soul began to write their own story. When light doesn't need eyes, I used to believe that light could only enter through the eyes. But then, I heard her story. And I started to wonder, what if light can also come in through the heart? Through words, through feelings, through a kind of inner vision that doesn't need sight at all. By the time Helen had learned dozens, then hundreds of words, her curiosity shifted. She no longer just wanted to know the names of things. She wanted to know the meaning behind them. One morning, after Annie wrote "Sun" in her hand, Helen paused, then carefully silently, "What is color?" No one had ever tried to explain color to her. She had never seen blue, never seen red. But somehow, she sensed that there was something out there. People described in ways that stirred their voice, that made their faces light up. So Annie tried. She said, "Red was like the warmth of sunlight on your skin. Blue was like the feeling of a breeze under a tree. Yellow was the brightness of a smile you could feel but not see. And black was the silence of night." I don't think Helen understood color the way we do, but she made sense of it in a language that belonged to her alone. She began to build a world out of touch, memory, and intuition. Annie once wrote that Helen could describe a summer field in words that felt impossibly vivid. Soft like cotton, waving like the sea, warm like being loved. She had never seen a wave, never felt the ocean breeze. But somehow, she knew how movement felt when something was free. She didn't just learn language, she began to imagine, to reach beyond her senses. When Annie taught her the word justice, Helen asked, "Is that like fairness, or is it something deeper?" When she learned soul, she touched her own chest and asked me, "Does it stay when the body goes away?" No one taught her to ask that. She simply had a mind that would not stay inside the lines. That's when Annie stopped teaching in the usual way. She began to offer ideas, to let Helen feel the shape of abstract things by folding them into real life. She taught poetry through images drawn in the palm, geography through piles of sand shaped into maps, history not through dates, but through the emotion of each moment. And Helen drank it all in, not because she was forced, but because her world was finally expanding, and she didn't want to miss any of it. Once, after reading a passage about winter, Helen smiled and sighed. "I feel it already, cold quietly and slow like a soft blanket." She had never seen snow, but she knew what silence felt like. She knew that cold had layers. She knew that warmth didn't only come from fire. I've often wondered, maybe when someone loses the outside, they gain more of the inside. Helen didn't need her eyes anymore, not to feel wonder, not to understand love, and not to build a world inside her own mind and live fully in it. People still called her poor thing, but Annie never used those words, because Helen was not broken. She was becoming. She wasn't trapped. She was exploring, in a way few ever get the chance to. And perhaps that's what made her journey so powerful. She didn't light up the world by seeing it. She lit it up by helping others see what truly matters without ever opening her eyes. The doors no one dared to open, most people would have stopped there. A girl who could now communicate, read, write, even imagine, that would have been miracle enough. But not for her. Because once the light found its way in, she wanted to walk toward it. She asked Annie, "Can I go to school like other children?" There was a pause, not because of doubt, but because no one had ever asked that before. A blind deaf girl in a regular classroom, with no books she could read, no voice she could raise. But Helen wasn't asking for special treatment. She was asking for the right to try. So Annie began again, but this time as a guide through schools that weren't built for girls like Helen. At first, they were rejected. "It's too complicated. She'll slow down the class. We don't have the resources." But Annie kept knocking. Not with anger, with presence. She didn't demand space. She simply showed up again and again until one day, a door quietly opened. The school was small, not well funded, but it had one thing that mattered: a teacher willing to listen. And so, Helen entered her first classroom. No bell rang for her. No one called her name aloud. But when she sat down, hands ready, heart open, she belonged. Annie would translate lectures into finger spelling as fast as she could, often hours at a time. Sometimes falling behind. Sometimes making mistakes. But Helen never blamed her. She knew effort when she felt it. And more than that, she knew grace. She passed her exams, then took on college-level material. She memorized entire books letter by letter, wrote essays word by word, with fingers that never stopped moving. Some called it obsession, but I think it was hunger, for meaning, for connection, for the chance to live fully in a world that once tried to shut her out. When someone asked Helen, "Why do you push so hard?" she simply replied, "Because I know what it means to be locked out. Now that I've found a key, I want to open every door I can." But it wasn't just about herself. She started to notice others. Those sitting alone, those treated differently, those no one believed in. One day, Annie saw her pause in front of a younger student who was struggling to read. Helen knelt down, took the child's hand, and gently wrote, "I used to live in the dark too. You don't have to stay there." She didn't say much after that. She just stayed for a while, long enough for the child to know. Someone saw them, even in silence. That's when I realized Helen wasn't just learning anymore. She was becoming something else entirely. She was becoming a light, not loud, not flashy, but constant. A light for those still waiting, still wondering if anyone would ever come back for them. She would go on to graduate with honors. The first person in her condition to do so. But if you asked her, her proudest moments weren't marked by certificates. They were marked by connection, by the soft gasp when a child learned their first word, by the quiet smile of a stranger who realized they were not alone. She walked through doors no one thought would ever open, not to prove something, but to hold them open for someone else. When one person lights up the world, some people change the world with speeches, with loud moments and flashing lights, with grand stages and bigger voices. Helen didn't have any of that, and yet she reached more hearts than most ever could. After graduating college, a milestone once thought impossible, she didn't rest. She could have stayed quiet, could have chosen a small, private life with books, warmth, and peace. But she didn't, because she knew that silence was still imprisoning many others, and someone had to speak on their behalf. With Annie by her side, she began to travel, city to city, country to country, standing before crowds she couldn't see, listening to applause she couldn't hear. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was the connection, the energy she could feel in the room, the way hands would reach for hers after a speech, the way letters poured in from people who had never told their story to anyone until they heard hers. She became a symbol, but never let it make her proud. She often said, "I am not what I've achieved. I am what I've endured and still chosen to love." As she met presidents, spoke with world leaders, walked among royalty. But her favorite moments, she said, were with children, especially those who didn't yet believe they had value. She would kneel, take their hand, and sign into their palms, "You are not broken, you are just becoming." And sometimes, that was enough to change the trajectory of a life. She helped establish schools for the blind and deaf, advocated for access, fought for rights in rooms where no one else had ever spoken the words. Inclusion, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes from someone who has lived both sides of silence. People often ask, "Weren't you ever bitter? That you missed out on so much?" She would smile and write back, "No, Lee. Because I also gained things others never will, like the sound of touch, the sight of trust, Lee, and the voice of silence." I once read a letter she wrote late in life. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was strong, Lee. "The world gave me many walls, but every time I ran into one, I learned how to listen deeper. And now, I walk through what once held me back." Her story wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to remind that strength doesn't always roar, that hope doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a hand gently tracing letters into your palm. Sometimes, it looks like a woman who cannot see the sun, but still manages to plant light wherever she goes. Helen didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be useful. And through her quiet fire, her relentless grace, and her refusal to be defined by what she lacked, she lit up places no spotlight ever reached. The legacy of someone who never saw. When someone leaves this world, what do they leave behind? I used to think it was their words, or the statues, the awards, the pages in a history book. But after learning about Helen, I believe legacy isn't what people see. It's what they feel in the quietest moments. No one knows how many lives she changed. There's no final count, no full list, only glances that softened, hands that moved more gently, and hearts that became more patient after hearing her name. A friend once told me that whenever she felt lost, she would reread a line Helen once wrote. When you can't see the path, just take one small step. You might be the one creating the trail for someone else. And so, she took that step, Lee. Not because she was brave, but because someone else had once walked through the dark and didn't stop, Lee. I think that's what a real legacy is. It's not carved into buildings or captured in applause, Lee. It's written quietly into the choices people make long after you're gone. In the years that followed, the organizations Helen helped build kept going. They gave children the tools to read, to write, to speak. Not because Helen asked them to, but because she gave them a reason they couldn't ignore. People often ask, how did someone who couldn't see or hear reach the whole world? The answer was never in the textbooks. It was in the little things. The way she laid her hand on someone else's and waited. The way she never stopped learning, even when no one required it. The way she smiled, even though the world had once assumed she would live in darkness forever. In her later years, Helen could barely walk, but she still read, still wrote, still listened, in her own quiet way. A friend once visited her and asked, "Don't you get tired of working?" Helen placed her hand gently in theirs and spelled, "I still have light." She wasn't talking about the sun. She meant the light inside, the one that had guided her when no one else could. And that light never went out. It lives in a small classroom where a child is learning their first word in Braille. In a library corner where someone older finally understands a quote they'd never felt until now. It lives in someone sitting alone on a rainy night, wondering if they're all alone, and remembering a girl who could neither see nor hear, but still loved the world deeply enough to change it. There's nothing flashy about that. Just a quiet truth. Legacy doesn't live where people saw you. It lives where they felt you, even when you weren't there. Helen never saw a single face, never heard a single laugh. But she helped people smile when they thought they were invisible. Quietly, in the light, the night has grown deep now. The rain outside still falls gently, each drop like a soft whisper. about patience, about strength, about things that don't need words to be felt. The story you just heard, about a girl who could not see, who could not hear, yet somehow helped the world feel more alive, doesn't need repeating now, because what's left is what it made you feel. Have you ever felt stuck, like you were in a place no one could reach, in a room with no doors and no one knocking? If so, I hope tonight you remember her. A little girl once locked in darkness, who lit her own way out, not with eyes, not with ears, but with a patient heart and a single hand that finally reached back. She didn't tear the walls down. She touched them gently, again and again, until they softened and let her through. I hope you'll be that gentle with yourself too. You don't have to fix everything overnight. You don't have to break free in one try. Just keep going, even if slowly, even if no one sees it, even if it's silent, because you're not alone. Someone once walked through a world that gave her no light, no sound, and still chose to leave behind something beautiful. Maybe you've guessed who she was. Maybe you've heard her name before. Or maybe you just felt her spirit here tonight. That's enough. Her power was never in being known. It was in being felt. And now, as the piano fades, as the rain settles into steady rhythm, and your breath grows softer, let yourself rest, Lee. Let yourself believe that even in the quietest parts of you, something bright still lives, something kind, something strong, something no one can ever take away. You don't have to see it. You just have to trust that it's there. Good night, Lee. And if this story touched something inside you, hold it close. Or leave a quiet note when the morning comes. I'll still be here, where the rain speaks gently and every story holds a little light for those still walking home.